Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Tonight's commemoration is entitled Fragments of Memory, Lost Notebooks of Children's Testimonies from the Holocaust, and features Dr. Regina Kazyulina and Dr. Christopher Mauriello, both directors of Salem State University's Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Today is also the 87th anniversary of the November 1938 pogroms, known as Kristallnacht, making this event even more poignant and pressing. We are very grateful to have the support of the college's administration and our elected officials, and so it's my great honor to begin this evening's program by introducing the president of Queensborough Community College, Dr. Christine Mangino, who will be followed by remarks from Queensborough President Donovan Richards and Queens District Attorney Melinda Katz.
Thank you, Dr. Laura Cohen, and good evening, everyone. It's truly a privilege to welcome you on behalf of Queensborough Community College to this evening's commemoration, an evening that reminds us of the enduring power of memory and our shared responsibility to bear witness. Tonight, we gather to mark the 87th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. On November 9th and 10th in 1938, Jewish communities across Germany and in Austria experienced state-sponsored terror for the first time under the Nazi regime. Synagogues, schools, and businesses were destroyed. Cemeteries desecrated. More than 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and deported. It is especially meaningful that we come together here in the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center. The center is not a museum or a library. It is a learning laboratory where students, survivors, and community members come together to learn through their hearts, their minds, and their actions. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center's mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the dangers of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Through that work, the center helps all of us, students, educators, and community members alike, find ways to become agents of positive social change in our own lives and in our communities. Even the architecture of this building tells part of that story. The angular glass panels that form the KHC's main exhibition space are a powerful symbol, a visual echo of that shattered night and a reminder of resilience, reflection, and hope. But what truly gives life to this space is what happens inside, the conversations, exhibitions, learning experiences, and partnerships that allow remembrance to become responsibility. Queensborough's commitment to Holocaust education has never been more important. Around the world and here at home, we are witnessing a rise in anti-Semitism, hate, and violence. In moments like these, remembrance becomes not only an act of mourning, but a call of moral clarity, compassion, and courage. Through the work of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, we continue to connect the past and the present, helping our students and our community confront anti-Semitism, bigotry, discrimination, and hate in all its forms. We are deeply grateful for the support of our local elected officials, including Queensborough President Donovan Richards and Queens District Attorney Melinda Katz, both of whom have sent messages of solidarity and support. So thank you, and may today's program strengthen our shared resolve to remember, to educate, and to act.
Good evening. I'm Queensborough President Donovan Richards, Jr. On behalf of the 2.4 million residents of Queens, I welcome you to tonight's commemoration in recognition of the 87th anniversary of Kristallnacht. 87 years ago today, the Nazis killed hundreds of Jews and arrested tens of thousands more. Countless synagogues and Jewish-owned homes and businesses were also destroyed by Nazis across Germany and Austria. This violence was a prelude to the Nazi murder of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. The Nazis were eventually defeated, but the impact of their brutality remained deeply felt by those who survived the Holocaust. This has especially been true for those who were children when they were victimized by the Nazis. The unique impact that such brutality can have on children is often not understood or recognized. Fortunately, in 1945, adult Holocaust survivors saw that the children among them were feeling a special kind of trauma due to what they had been through. These adults opened several schools for the large numbers of children who had been orphaned or displaced. And to help these children heal, their teachers encouraged them to write and speak about what the Nazis had done to them. This early effort at documenting wartime atrocities and a unique impact on children is the subject of the Comfortberg Holocaust Center's annual commemoration of Kristallnacht tonight. The Comfortberg Holocaust Center is a worldwide leader in the study of the Holocaust and its legacy. We in Queens are so proud the center is based in our borough. And I'm sure tonight's event will lead to further advances in understanding the impact of the Holocaust, especially on our children. For it is through greater understanding that we are able to bring ourselves closer to a world free of anti-Semitism and all forms of hate and violence. So I deeply thank the Comfortberg Holocaust Center for convening tonight's event and for its continuing efforts to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. Thank you so much. May God bless you all.
I'm D.A. Katz. Hi, everyone. It's an honor to join the Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College for its annual Kristallnacht commemoration. Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, is a chilling reminder of the violent consequences of rampant anti-Semitism across the globe. 87 years ago, on November 9th and 10th of 1938, synagogues were burned, Jewish businesses were looted, homes were destroyed, and thousands of Jews were arrested, killed, or sent to concentration camps, simply because they were Jewish. Kristallnacht was not the beginning of anti-Semitism, nor was it the end. But these tragic events mark a crucial turning point that led to the systematic persecution and mass murder of the Holocaust. That is why commemoration ceremonies are so important, especially as most of the survivors, those who bore witness to the horrors, are no longer here to speak for themselves. Year after year, Kristallnacht serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of inaction. It is our duty to ensure that history does not repeat itself. As the only Jewish district attorney in the state of New York, I stand in solidarity with the diverse Jewish communities that call this borough home. We share a collective responsibility to confront and eradicate anti-Semitism in all of its forms, especially in light of the recent rise in anti-Semitic incidents worldwide. My office is dedicated to combating misinformation and works every day to protect our Jewish community from all threats of violence, harassment, vandalism, and assault. We take this responsibility because 87 years later, vigilance, education, and moral courage are our greatest tools against the repetition of history. Let us reaffirm our values that every person, no matter their race, background, religion, or language, is created equal and deserves to be treated as such throughout their lives. We will continue to combat anti-Semitism for a safer, more inclusive Queens. Thank you.
Our sincerest thanks to President Mangino, Queensborough President Richards, and Queens District Attorney Katz. Tonight's commemoration is underwritten by the Ava Bobrow Memorial Fund and is co-sponsored by 10 organizations around the country. They include the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Holocaust Resource Center and Education Center of Keene University, the Reeves Center for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution at Christopher Newport University, the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, the Center for Genocide and Human Rights Research in Africa and the Diaspora at Northeastern Illinois University, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University, the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University, the Sam and Francis Freed Holocaust and Genocide Academy at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University, the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University, and the Queens College Center for Jewish Studies. I'd like to thank our colleagues from Media Services and Digital Transformation Departments, including Phil Roncaroni and Jesse Pina, as well as Barana Soman, the KHC's Museum Coordinator. Tonight's event is happening simultaneously online and in person, so before we begin, for those of you here in the center, if you could please make sure to turn your cell phones off or to vibrate. And after the presentation, we'll host a brief Q&A. For those of you online, please drop your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and here we'll pass around a mic for everyone. And now it's my joy and excitement and honor and privilege to welcome tonight's two guest speakers. First is Dr. Christopher Mauriello, who's professor of history and director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Salem State. He teaches and researches in the field of modern European intellectual and cultural history, World War II, the Holocaust, and comparative genocide studies. And he is the author of Forced Confrontation, The Politics of Dead Bodies in Germany at the End of World War II, and co-author of From Boston to Berlin, A Journey Through World War II in Images and Words. Dr. Regina Kazyulina is the assistant director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Salem State and a visiting assistant professor of history there. Her research interests include everyday life under German occupation, the Holocaust by bullets, and the gendered lived experiences of Soviet civilians. Her book, Women Under Suspicion, Fraternization, Espionage, and Punishment in the Soviet Union During World War II, explores the experiences of non-Jewish women in the army or resistance or at home in occupied territories during and after Nazi occupation. So it's my great pleasure to welcome them to the podium.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome to everybody for joining us both in person and on the internet. Again, my name is Chris Mauriello, and I'd like to thank particularly the president, Christine Mangino, and Laura Cohen for inviting us and representatives for speaking on tonight's commemoration of Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht, of course, occurred on November 9th and 10th, 1938. And as you heard from the speakers, it was an event that was the beginning of state-sponsored terror against Jewish communities of Germany and Austria. I also wanted to add that it was one of the key moments in which the world knew what was happening to Jews in Germany, and that the world, no one after that point could actually say that they did not know what was happening in German policies against the Jews. And that began in 1938. It was in the New York Times, it was in papers throughout the country. And yet, the world stayed silent. It is in that spirit of memory and recovery that we tonight, Regina and I, will be speaking about the children's testimonies. Tonight we're going to take you on a journey of research and discovery of our own about these unique sources in history. The Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Salem State University was founded in 2014. It was the natural extension of a center that had existed for 30 years before we did, our community center, the Holocaust Center Boston North. That center started to think about transitioning to the university after the survivor Sonia Schreiber-Weitz passed away in 2010. And as a university, we began to absorb the Holocaust Center Boston North's collection of artifacts, books, art collections, and we began to put them into our Salem State University Library archives. And there were boxes of unmarked artifacts that stayed in those archives until we had a chance to go through them in 2018. So Susan Edwards, the archivist, and I started to open up some of these boxes because we were starting to catalog our collection. As expected, there were 30 years of documents, photographs, and other items in these boxes, and nobody had seen them since they were established in the 1980s or 1990s. In one box, we found a collection of bound notebooks, loose-leaf sheets of handwriting in Polish. Since neither Susan or I read Polish, we quickly turned them over to one member of the faculty who did read Polish. And she said, "I'm not really sure what these are, but they appear to be testimonies or at least questionnaires of young children who survived the Holocaust." And we had discovered that this was an unbelievable discovery of completely unpublished, never seen before testimonies from 9 children who survived the Holocaust and were at Bergen-Belsen Displaced Persons Camps in 1945, 1946. And we couldn't really know anything about them except there were photographs that were also in an envelope that was also in the box. And in that, In those photographs, we recognize the Bergen-Belsen DP camp, many pictures of children with their teachers, a few programs from some of the events that the schools were putting on. Bergen-Belsen was in the British zone of occupation in April of 1945. It's at this crucial moment that one of our community members stepped forward, Zeli Kaplan, who helped support us to have those Polish notebooks translated. So I'll show you a picture of them again. To be translated from Polish to English. And they were converted in 2019. In unexpected ways, therefore, we came upon this, we had them translated, but we had questions. Where did they come from? Who recorded these testimonies and why? And who were these young survivors? All we knew was their name and their birth date, which was at the beginning of each testimony. We had some photographs, but we knew nothing else. And that is really where our research trip began. And as I say to people all the time, in unexpected ways, we did not find this research topic, it found us. These things were not translated, they were not published, and as historians, we were so excited to start work, but there was a lot of questions that we had, and I'll turn over to Regina to talk about those questions and issues.
All right, thank you. We had, at this point, no idea, again, of the provenance of these notebooks. But a deep reading of the testimonies began to yield clues about who may have donated the collection. There were questions and asides within the testimonies that revealed the role of an intermediary and suggested that these testimonies were in fact transcribed interviews. These are a few of the examples. So, for example, quote, one of the girls was described as beautiful, large, blue eyes, face as ruddy as an apple, a little woman who wishes to dedicate herself to her film career. Another aside was from a different testimony. The girl is seemingly petrified because of what she's been through and being orphaned. And then in this one in particular, we got a sense of, again, the intermediary and the role they played in terms of translating, that all the testimonies were in Polish, but at the same time, the girl that she was speaking to, she wrote down that, quote, the girl is speaking half in Russian, half in Yiddish. As she tells me these macabre recollections, she is anxious, she's trembling in nervous agitation, every muscle on her face. I can barely understand her. Speak calmly, I ask. I'd like to understand you. And so we have a sense that, again, this intermediary is interviewing these girls, but at the same time, even as she's writing in Polish, she's also translating as she's going. We could also see that there were different writing implements that were used throughout the notebooks, seemingly at random at first, which suggested that the intermediary was going back to correct, to add to and edit the text after they had first transcribed the children's words. And you can see that here. So again, as they're interviewing, they're writing this down, then afterwards going back and adding information based off of what they had heard. And finally, there was a name that appeared. On several loose leaf pages and photographs, the name was Felcha. There was no last name. And so again, it made us question, who is this Felcha? Is she the one that is writing down these interviews, these testimonies? There were also other names that appeared, such as Miss Yeva, Miss Renia, Miss Robel. Again, who are these women? What was their relationship? And what was their relationship to these girls? When Bergen-Belsen was liberated in April 1945, there were as many as 500 children at the concentration camp. As the Red Army began liberating Poland, the Germans evacuated concentration camps in the east, and survivors who were still able to walk were forced on death marches towards camps located further west, and Bergen-Belsen, being in Saxony, was one of the later camps to be liberated by the British Army in April. And so Bergen-Belsen became one of the final destinations of a lot of death marches at the end of the war, and a lot of children ended up on these that had survived other concentration camps. Specifically, they were transported from Buchenwald and from Theresienstadt. And once at Bergen-Belsen, survivors at the camp kept them safe, fed them with what little food that was left, particularly Hadassah Bimko, who later on would marry Joseph Rosensoft, and they would be in charge of the self-governing organization within the camp. And they were kept alive in what was called kind of the Kinderheim at the time. And after Belsen was liberated and turned into a DP camp, the number of children began to grow as Jewish survivors returned home to Poland, to their hometowns, found that there was no one left. There was also anti-Semitism in Poland after the war, and so many then left and went to these new DP camps in Germany. Conditions in Bergen-Belsen just before and after liberation were horrific. There was mass starvation, of course, but also there was extreme overcrowding in the camp, and there's a raging typhus epidemic. And some of the most kind of appalling images that we have come from Bergen-Belsen at the end of the war. They're available, you can see, in the Imperial War Museum. But those who survived began to organize themselves almost immediately after the camp was liberated. And one of the priorities that quickly emerged was the fate and care of these children. Research by Boaz Cohen, Hagit Lofsky, and others have uncovered several schools that were opened by survivors in Bergen-Belsen in 1945 and 46. Information about these schools is still fragmentary, but the names of several teachers have been recovered. And thanks to the recollections of Helena Vrobel, who became the headmistress of the Jewish gymnasium that she opened in December of 45, we know a little about how these schools were formed and the kind of instruction that occurred in them. Vrobel donated a testimony to Yad Vashem in the 1960s, and she had recovered from a bout of typhus. And when she did, she saw an advert in the camp that there was going to be a school that was going to be opened in late spring of 45. She was still very weak at that point in time, but she answered the advert and soon began teaching at a newly opened Jacob Edelstein Elementary School. The school at that point in time consisted of 3 classes. Vrobel taught 1 class, and the other 2 classes were taught by 2 sisters, Fiola and Renja Zimmerman. They were sisters, survivors from Sosnowiec. And the headmistress was Sala Lekovitz. And you can see this is a program from Yad Vashem that has the names of some of the teachers. We have an Eva Kielman. Again, Miss Eva also appeared in our notebooks as well. And initially, this was open in nearby Cell, then it was moved to Bergen-Belsen, and existed from June of 1945. Among the loose leaf papers that we found within our collection and with the notebooks were again, photographs and this program from a Hanukkah celebration that occurred in December of 1945. By December, Helena Vrobel had opened a gymnasium for teenagers. The elementary school, she recalled, was an important first step, but after a few months, she began to realize there's a lot of teenagers in the DP camp, and she was worried about their fate and what was going to happen to them. And so she petitioned the British authorities to be able to open a gymnasium. And so this gymnasium was opened in December of 45, and we have, again, this program from the Hanukkah celebration, as well as this grainy photograph of what may be one of the few photographic images of documents of that program. You can see the dreidel at the top. And at the same time, on this, again, program, you see several names. Phyllis Zimmerman again. David Schumann was a member of the Jewish Brigade that helped also open these schools. Jacob Lubliner was one of the students. Once we learned about the history of these schools and were able to compile a partial list of survivors associated with them, we began to make inquiries to the Bergen-Belsen archives, to the International Tracing Service archives at Bad Arolsen for information about the schools and the teachers. Although it seemed unlikely that Fiola was the Felcha mentioned in the testimonies, we requested information about her and her sister Renja, since they were associated with both schools and their names appeared in various documents that we had. And this is, again, a photograph from the Bergen-Belsen archive. And you can see Phyllis Zimmerman standing on the very left. Renja Zimmerman is the second person on the right, and then Sala Lekovitz is the third person on the left. It took time for our inquiries to bear fruit, but after several months, we began receiving responses that eventually led us to be able to answer the questions of who transcribed these testimonies and why. So Phil and Regina Zimmerman were born in Sosnowiec, Poland in 1920 and 1918, respectively. They worked in the field of education during the interwar period, and they returned to this field in 1945 once they recovered and were able to work in these schools at Bergen-Belsen. During the German occupation, the nearby city of Katowice, today it's about a 10-minute drive from Sosnowiec, contained the headquarters of the so-called Schmelt system of forced labor camps. And Sosnowiec and its sister city, Beczen, provided much of the Jewish forced laborers for these camps, with a former Jewish school in Sosnowiec as a transit camp. And before the war, it was a Jewish school. During the war, it was a transit camp. And then after, it is now went back to being a Polish school, actually. And there's a commemoration plaque kind of on the side of the building as to the history that it had during the war. Historians are just beginning to get a sense of the scale of the system and to document the individual camps. But many tens of thousands of Jewish men, young men and women from Sosnowiec, from Beczen, and surrounding shtetls became victims of the system of Jewish forced labor. In March 1943, the Zimmerman sisters were deported to Graben, a Schmelt camp that is located southwest of Wrocław, where they worked in a flax factory that had been turned into a forced labor camp. And then when the Schmelt organization was taken over by the SS in 1944, Graben became a subcamp of the Gross-Rosen concentration camp. By 1945, as the Red Army was approaching Gross-Rosen, Graben was evacuated, first on a death march to Gross-Rosen, and then from Gross-Rosen on a death march to Bergen-Belsen. And that is how the Zimmerman sisters ended up being in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and then eventually the displaced person camp. And you can see here, this is from the Bergen-Belsen archive. It's actually, the left is a photograph that was actually donated by Helena Vrobel to the Bergen-Belsen archive. And it's Phil Zimmerman on the left and Regina on the right. And then on the right is a list, partial list of survivors from Bergen-Belsen we were able to receive from the Arlson archive. So in 1951, the Zimmerman sisters, we learned through all our research, together with other surviving members of their family, emigrated to the United States. Phil was settled in New York, but Regina settled in Boston. Their niece, a fellow Holocaust survivor who was born in 1942 in the Lviv ghetto, emigrated with Regina and eventually lived in the North Shore of Boston, right next door to the Holocaust Center, Boston North. Once we learned that there was a connection, this very close connection, we knew that we had finally found the owner of our notebooks. Thanks to connections within the Jewish community, we were able to connect with and interview Phil and Regina's niece. By that time, they had passed away, but her niece is still with us. And she recalled the notebooks and the photographs that she had donated to the Holocaust Center, Boston North, many years ago. By a twist of fate, we also found among our artifact collection, the suitcase that Phil brought with her across the ocean. And like the notebooks, it didn't really have provenance at first, but having uncovered Phil's story, we were able to then make the connection to the suitcase. I remember I was sitting in our conference room looking at our display cases and seeing, wait a second, this is the suitcase. And so it was ultimately Phil Zimmerman who just transcribed the interviews in 1946. The children were her students. We do not know exactly why she did this, but we believe that she recorded them as part of an effort to help her students process the trauma of their experiences. By articulating what they had experienced, she and the other teachers believed that they might be able to start to heal. In his work on Bergen-Belsen in the Jewish Gymnasium run by Helena Vrobel, Dr. Boris Cohen uncovered a larger project undertaken by Helena Vrobel at the Jewish Gymnasium. Beginning in late 1945, Vrobel encouraged students to write essays about their journey to Bergen-Belsen. We believe that the testimonies we found within the records of the Holocaust Center Boston North were related to this larger project. But unlike the essays that Vrobel encouraged her students to write, our testimonies were interviews that were transcribed by Phyllis Zimmerman herself. Her efforts to document these stories of her students were clearly linked to those undertaken by Vrobel. The two women knew each other, they worked together, and they were friends. This is actually testified by these photographs, again, from the Bergen-Belsen archive, donated by Helena Vrobel. And the left photograph, we were actually, as we were interviewing their niece, we found out that this was actually not in Bergen-Belsen, but taken in Stuttgart during Renja's marriage. And that Helena Vrobel, of course, was there as well. And on the right, we can see Phyllis Zimmerman on the first row, second on the left, with Helena Vrobel, third from the right, and their students at Bergen-Belsen. So many questions still remain, but what we do know is that Phyllis Zimmerman took these notebooks with her after she left Bergen-Belsen. She took them with her when she emigrated to the US, and they remained in her possession until she passed away in 1999. And then it was her niece that donated them to the Holocaust Center Boston North, and we now are able to kind of recreate their story. So with that, kind of the first questions again we had was trying to determine the nature of these notebooks, where they came from. Once we knew the full story of the notebooks and their provenance, we started to learn more about the children and whose testimonies were recorded in 1946. We began making inquiries again at the International Tracing Service at Bad Arolsen, Yad Vashem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. We also began doing genealogical work using Ancestry to try to recreate family trees in order to be able to find out if there are any surviving family members that might have testified, maybe still with us today. We searched the USC Shoah Visual History Archive and the Fortuna Video Archive for Holocaust testimonies to see if they or their family members gave testimonies as adults, and in many cases we were actually able to find later testimonies that either they or their family members provided, as well as memoirs and unpublished papers. From the many records we collected, in addition to the interviews in the notebooks, we began to trace their stories and trajectories. We began to gain a picture of what their lives looked like before the Nazi invasion. We learned more about their families, their faith, communities, as well as wartime and post-war fates. I'm gonna switch.
Thanks, Regina. One of the goals of our project, if you will, is to take these microhistories, these testimonies from children, and then connect it or create themes that help us further understand the Holocaust. And that's the point we're at now in terms of the research, is what themes can we draw from this? Can we draw any conclusions that will help us understand not only the experience of these young girls, but of the Holocaust more generally? So we started to think through some of the themes, and some of the themes came to us very quickly, and others we've had to work together on this. The first one that we really were interested in was what's called layered memory. What's really interesting about our project is that we have testimonies from the Fortuna Archive or Shoah Foundation that were done in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And we have about 6 of these young girls who gave testimony later in their life to Shoah. But they gave testimony as 12 and 13-year-olds in 1946. So what does someone remember from the immediate effects of coming from the Holocaust, surviving it, and losing their families in 1946 at the age of 12 or 13? And then 30 to 40 years later as adults, who many of them have spoken to community groups and school groups. What is the difference in memory between those two experiences? The first one, when they were young, they were interviewed by teachers. Did the teachers add anything? We all know in questions and questionnaires that the interviewer is very important. And we know that they're talking to the teachers because of those responses you saw earlier. So one of our tasks is to think through Holocaust memory and testimony memory, and to look at the differences between the 1946 testimonies and the testimonies given later in their lives. And I think that will really bear fruit in thinking through some of the complex issues of testimony and memory in the Holocaust. We also realized that the Holocaust was, depending on where you were and who you were and what your connections were, the Holocaust is not a universal experience for the victims who underwent this horrible experience. That we know things like the ghettos and life in the ghettos were very diverse depending on where you were, how you got there. And we want to kind of, if you will, open up the Holocaust to multiple experiences of these girls. The only thing they have in common, these, I think we're now up to 13, Holocaust children, survivors, have in common is they were interviewed by the two Zimmerman sisters in 1946. They didn't know each other. They didn't cross paths with each other. There's no reference, cross-reference to each other. They come from very different parts of Poland and Ukraine. So the only thing they have in common is this experience, but their diversity of their experiences needs to be written, it needs to be talked about. We also realize how complex the Holocaust system is, and thinking through the Holocaust as not simply a matter of what I call the traditional narrative of ghettoization, deportation, extermination. These young girls experienced the Holocaust in very different ways than that. They were at transfer camps, they were at transit camps, they were at labor camps, they were at concentration camps, they went to death camps, they were in death marches, they survived, they were liberated. All of them were very different. And looking at the whole system of camps, which you know from the Holocaust Museum, over 40,000 camps existed in 1944 throughout occupied Europe. Also, survival strategies. Survival strategies were very important. How did they survive besides luck, which is always part of it, right? They survived because their parents hid them. They survived because neighbors helped hide them. They survived because of their social status, because they had money and jewels to pay off Polish or Ukrainian neighbors to help and hide them. They moved. One thing that we talk about is a culture of movement. It's amazing how mobile they were. They were when the Germans came in 1939, they moved to the next town with a cousin, and they were staying ahead of things. There was a lot of times they're like, I didn't know how I got there. I mean, they're 12 and 13 years old when they're interviewing them. So it's fascinating to look at the culture of movement. And also this idea of a kind of culture of complexity of liberation. We see liberation as Americans as a triumphant moment. This is a moment of trauma for these young people. And what's really interesting, I think, for us is also thinking through the nature and nuances of childhood trauma. And that becomes an important aspect. Also, thinking of themes, non-Jewish neighbors. Did non-Jewish neighbors help, or were they perpetrators? And the answer is both. Some neighbors helped, some didn't help, some were perpetrators outright. Also, the unique experiences of Jewish community in the East as compared to the West. Very different experiences if you were a Polish Jew than if you were a German Jew, for example. So we had gleaned much from the interviews and the archival record. But we decided that we really needed to go to these places. I believe that historians can learn the most by going to places where history happened. We had the record. We had a geographical sense of where these young people came from. We wanted to see firsthand their hometowns, their cities, look at the ghettos, the labor and the concentration and death camps that were mentioned in the testimonies. We wanted to visit local archives. We wanted to meet with local historians. We wanted to talk to community members and faith groups who could help guide us for additional information. For us, it was the most powerful experiences that, of this project was actually going to those places. So I'm going to go through a couple of photographs with you. We just got back on October 17th. So this is really fresh. Actually, the whole presentation is very fresh because the research is ongoing. So this is, as you can read, we actually had the opportunity because of the tracing service and the later testimonies that they gave to Shoah, for example. We knew their childhood homes. So we're standing in their childhood homes here. We are, right in Sosnowiec, Poland. This is what's today the former ghetto, the first ghetto in Poland, established in October 8th, 1939, and Sala F. That's very interesting. I mean, we don't have permission from the family to use last names yet, so we're going to use initials until that. Her family were deported to this ghetto, and she went to a number of camps, including Auschwitz. We were there in October, and this is actually Judenplatz, where the center of the ghetto and deportations occurred from this. And I'll let you read about Sala's experience. This comes from her testimony that she gave in 1946. I think by reading this, you can get a sense of how important this documentation is. This documentation is going to see the light of day after being in an archive since 1946. And just to show you how little things change in some of this is a more provincial Polish city, Piotrowo-Trzeblinski. So this is again boarded up, very kind of, what I said to my colleagues, including our photographers, it seemed like the Russian army just left, the Soviet army just left. This is a really interesting story that because of this research, we've uncovered, as we oftentimes do as historians, one historical project leads to another historical project, leads to another one. This is a fascinating one about the ghetto fighters in the Sansovice-Bedzin ghetto and the family that was in this home. Then the home, of course, became a secret location for ghetto fighters for resistance to the ghetto. And most resistance fighters were killed during the ghetto liquidation here. The Polak family, who was the family who lived in this residence, returned after liquidation and witnessed dead bodies laid out, and you can see the courtyard right in front of the building. And we know that from the actual record. And there's an organization that's now trying to restore and make a museum in this ghetto fighters' house. And we had a chance to talk to them and actually go into the hiding spaces for the ghetto fighters. Also, all right. That's all right. This is, you can read along with it. This is a guard tower at the Judenlager Blechhammer concentration camp, established in 1942 as a forced labor camp. And just to give you a sense of this, when you're walking, you're driving down a road, you pull in, there's one small sign on the side of a highway, you pull in, and then you're all alone walking through the woods, and this is what's left. There's no formal, there's a few signs saying from the Park Service what you're looking at, but what you're looking at here is a guard tower to the left and the crematorium to the right. It's a small crematorium, but it's a labor camp for the German war machine that was making synthetic fuel, and hundreds of Jews suffered in this part of the camp. The camp was very large. That's what's left of it. It's essentially uninterpreted. So this is an experience of one of our testimonies from working at the Blechhammer camp. Krebs is cancer in German. These are gut-wrenching testimonies, people losing their parents. This is the memorial that is at the camp. It's done during the time of Poland under Soviet rule. Some of our girls that were interviewed in 1946 went through Gross Rosen. It's a camp that a lot of people don't visit. It's in Poland. And this is the main gate. 120,000 prisoners, 40,000 died. Fila and Renia Zimmerman, as well as you hit it, were interned here into the subcamps and passed through there. The day we were there, it was raining and cold, and we were dressed warmly, and we were still so cold. And it was October. So I think for the historian to experience that is an important moment as well. This is the quarry that prisoners worked in and died in. It was one of the most difficult work, and that quarry is still there. You just walk in, it's right to the left of the camp. And Regina had mentioned the Graben concentration camp, and this is where Reina and Fiala Zimmerman labored and suffered, and then began their terrible death march through Gross Rosen and back into Germany and to Bergen-Belsen. As we talk tonight, we are amidst a research project, and we're inviting you into our research process. So if it's a little messy, that's okay. We have started to develop some questions. We've started to develop a work plan. And what we're really excited about tonight is to hear from people, questions that you might have, ideas you might have that could work their way into the project and ultimately the book. So we really thank you for joining us tonight. And on behalf of Regina Kazyulina and myself, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Christopher. Thank you so much, Regina. We're going to take a 1-minute break and set up for Q&A. So for those of you online, just stay tuned. We'll be right with you. It's really powerful to hear you both talk about your experiences. It's really, really fresh. And one of the questions that came in, I have my own questions, but one of the ones that came in that really just hit me for a moment is to talk about your experiences as researchers, as humans, as parents, in interrogating this history and getting to know the children and retracing the steps where they grew up and retracing the places of tremendous horror, and then to kind of see them again in using their voices as children in the testimonies, and then also in the later interviews you did. Can you talk a little bit about the personal impact?
I mean, yes, this research, it's always very difficult. It's rewarding to be able to, what makes it possible is being able to recapture these stories, to give voice to Reina and to Fiala, and to be able to commemorate them, what they did, and to to be able to remember these children as well. It's also rewarding, or to see, it makes it possible to kind of, when you see the later testimonies and hear about the lives that they were able to live afterwards, their resilience, the families that they were able to raise afterwards, that also kind of, makes this more possible to do. But it is very difficult, especially, this was a very heavy trip. Yes, and again, my first work I started when I was just starting graduate school. The work that I was doing was on young women, and so there was again that personal connection as well, kind of being able to see their experiences. Here it's a little less because they're children, but at the same time we're parents, and so it makes you think about, just your own children. It's so difficult.
Yeah, just to add to Regina, I've written books, co-authored books, and I've written books by myself. I'm fortunate this time that I had Regina with me, because that's someone to bounce ideas and feelings and difficult moments off of. We also had a photographer, Glenn, who went with us as well, who was great. And he's been with me on a number of trips and photographed for the previous books as well. And he always says the same thing, and he's Jewish, and he goes on our trips, and he said, "How do you keep doing this?" And I said, well, for me, it's a research topic, and I have to keep thinking like that to keep some distance from it. And he says, "Are you wearing your academic armor?" as he calls it, because we're going through these difficult, when we were in Auschwitz, we were at Gross Rosen, we went to these, actually more moving for me was the smaller, unidentified, unmarked labor camps, knowing that people suffered there. I have 3 children, and it's always been very difficult for me to visit the children's exhibit at Auschwitz, for example. But again, it's so important, the project. I keep thinking this to myself, it's so important that we get these words out. These teachers spent days interviewing these students. These students had stories to tell. They were very young, and it's something we haven't really emphasized yet, but the teachers were not there as historians. The teachers were there as social workers and teachers who wanted to help these students return to as much as normal as they could and to overcome their trauma. And therefore, in many ways, I feel like it's an obligation that we have to bring these stories to light, because that was the original intent of these stories, right? So I'm actually quite proud of the work that we're doing, and I think that kind of offsets the difficulty of it.
It's interesting you bring that up. There were several times where I was thinking about experiences I've had going across Bosnia and Herzegovina. And you mentioned something about the school being a school before the war, a detention center during the war, and then going back into becoming a school at the end of the war. And that's very consistent, not just in Bosnia, but in a lot of different conflicts where children have to go back into the community in general. Another thing that I was thinking about when you talked about layered memory is the process by which you interview people. And you just said teachers are not there to document for the students as much as children, as much as to kind of be social workers and help them process. But then decades later, they're talking about their memories again. So I want to ask about consent, because at one point you're using first initials or the first name and not the last name. Can you talk a little bit about the complexity of what goes into interviewing people who are in these really fraught positions in their lives?
Yes, I mean, we don't know. Helena Robel had started, this essay project, and she created an archive that is at the Ghetto Freedom Fighters House archive now. But we don't know under what directions were given to the students. We don't know under what conditions. And in this case as well, we don't know how much they knew about what was being recorded. And so, we're trying to, again, trace living family members and talk to them, and then hopefully that will kind of give us a sense of what to do. In terms of those that gave testimonies to Shoah, they gave their consent. But yes, it's a difficult and something we're having to kind of work through and decide. But we're hoping again to be able to contact family members and work with them through this. And as for the testimonies themselves, they're consistent. The story, everything's it stays the same. It's just it's the different questions that are asked by the interviewers at Shoah. They're able to kind of gain more information because they're professionals. And for the teachers, it's just getting this kind of probably what might have been their first time, getting this on paper, having the students actually be able to articulate what happened to them. And we also have to remember that Phil and Renia, they went through these horrific experiences themselves as well. So as they're doing this, they themselves are processing their own trauma. So there's a lot of questions, yes, and it's kind of difficult that we have difficult questions we need to wrestle with, but I'm hoping, again, as we move forward, we'll be able to contact more family members and share this research with them and then see how they feel.
And to be fair, I didn't hear of layered memory until somebody 2 weeks ago said, "Are you dealing with layered memory?" And I was like, I guess I am now. So it's a very complex. The interviews, as I said earlier, in 1946, and then it's the same people as grown adults giving testimony 30 years later. It's a very different experience, but as Regina said, their stories are very consistent. They say what they did, how they lived through the ghetto. They know what happened when they left. They particularly know when their parents were taken away from them, or when they were reunited with their parents as young people. Their focus is on the family and the loss of family, which is completely understandable. But they fill out a lot of the details of that journey between 1939 and 1945 in their later Shoah testimonies. But we have, as historians, we really started to have to read a lot more about testimony and going back to Lawrence Langer and folks like that to really understand the differences between the 1946 interviews and the 1980s testimony, which is kind of like direct, So that's an interesting part of the project, but it's something we need to kind of fill out.
Well, and I think what's interesting when you're talking about children is so often we're mentioning women and children in passing, and they're not considered to be humans with agency.
Right.
And you're not only giving them voice, but you're taking them out of sort of this infantilized role, and they have voices. I'm thinking about a lot of the work that the Anne Frank Center does to really fill in how Anne Frank is perceived. She, there's sort of the stereotype, everything's rosy toward the end with this major quote she has, but she's actually a much more complicated person with very specific feelings about things and going through puberty. I have a question for you in your role also as a center focusing on Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And so somebody's asked the question, sadly, genocides continue to occur with at least 5 million children in Darfur struggling to survive currently, and there's a siege in El Fasher as we speak. What would you do to advise teachers and scholars who work with Sudanese children?
That's
it's a big
question. It's difficult. I think, working with your advisors that you have at your school, and your social workers, really bringing them into this conversation and thinking about how you do, trauma-informed teaching,
Right.
and really, getting a sense of, as much as you can, of what's happening, getting that background, and being very, sensitive and careful in the way that you approach these subjects, because, some of this is similar. Each instance is unique, but there's also trauma that they can be transferred. And so I think, again, working with all of the services that you have at the school, and building those lesson plans around them.
Yeah, and we have run a lot of educational programming at our center in Salem, and we've done a number of different workshops on Guatemalan genocide, Rwandan genocide, and students in our communities come from these places, and there's a lot of silences in families. And so what most teachers ask us for is a session on trauma-informed teaching, which I would suggest every teacher do who's dealing with these sensitive issues, as Regina said, because there are common experiences, and I think that we can, through this project, reach a wide audience of child survivors and children's experiences during genocide, understanding the uniqueness of it, but also understanding the complexities of doing any kind of interviewing. So when students ask me, can I interview my grandfather and my grandmother, I go, slow down. We need to talk about, what you can do as, a grandchild, but also what you can do as an oral historian. So,
well, there's a lot of complexity to this because, if we think about people being interviewed in conflict, we're talking about people having to process trauma. You might have psychologists there. You might have lawyers there. You might have anthropologists there. There's all sorts of, and you're talking also, and something you did beautifully in your presentation is to talk about almost the level of trust that was created between the teachers and the girls. I'm curious, just in terms of, we were talking a little bit before about a new museum that's being created. A lot of times in conversations about museum displays, what's appropriate for children is not you think a lot about, but in context of war and mass atrocities, children also experience these things, and children are a part of it, and there's a balance there. I'm curious, we have two sets of questions that are left, but one speaks very clearly to how can people access these testimonies? Will they be made available online at some point? And are you going to put them into a book or an exhibition?
Yes, so we are working on both. They have been digitized, but we are working on both we just actually displayed last week a partial exhibit on these testimonies, and so we're building out a bigger one that hopefully next year we'll be able to bring to the community in the Boston area. But additionally, yes, we're also working on a book that this research will be available. But
someday.
But as this is an ongoing research project, but yes. That is the goal to do both.
I have one more question online. a question to you, Regina. Which languages were the poems written in, and what were their functions? Healing, survival, resistance, or something else?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure.
The notebooks.
What languages were the poems written in? And the function of the poems themselves?
Poems.
I think.
Well, the notebooks themselves,
Yeah.
I guess, they're written in Polish. But again, as kind of some of the asides that we saw, most likely some of the students were speaking either, in some cases in Russian, most likely in Yiddish. We have, most are from the Silesia area, so Katowice, Sosnowiec, that kind of area. We have some from Krakow. But there were one girl that fled from central Poland. Actually, in 1939, they fled to the Soviet Union, and so they were in western Ukraine, and then ended up in an area that was under Romanian control called Transnistria. We have a boy that was near the Rivne region of Ukraine as well, and survived both. He was hidden by Ukrainian neighbors, but also with Jewish partisans in the area. And a girl from Vilnius. So we have, again, this wide range, and this is where it's fascinating to bring them into conversation, because the experiences are so unique when you're talking about the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, the Holocaust by bullets, as opposed to the industrial nature that you have in Poland. But I believe most of them, again, they're written in Polish, but most likely they were giving their testimonies at that time in a combination of Polish and Yiddish and maybe some Russian as well, depending on where they were. But so exactly, so Phila was speaking multiple languages and all translating this and then transcribing it.
And the Bergen-Belsen Displaced Persons Camp was quite an amazing, I mean, I was there, I think, 2022 or 2021, to the archives there. It was an amazing DP camp that had its own school system, it had its own hospital, it had a bus that picked up the kids at the DP, in the place where they slept and brought them to the schools. It was an obvious attempt to reconstruct Jewish life after the war. But it was always with the intention of leaving, right? In the DP camps, leaving. And the fact that these two teachers created a school, the amount of work that they must have put in to do that. And they were teachers before the war, or they were involved with education before the war, and to continue it after was probably an important part of their healing as well. To something possibly positive could come out of this horrendous experience. So really, I think really admirable people, and the fact that they left the notebooks, again, speaks to our responsibility as historians and community members to publish them. A lot of work went into this, and we're actually really happy that it'll see the light of day.
It's tremendous. I just want to look out. Does anyone have any questions that are here? Thank you for bringing them to the light of day. I'm thinking about Irina Nemirovsky. She had something called the Suite Francais. I don't know if you remember. This came out many years ago. It was a suitcase, and the author had written several novels on little sheets of paper.
Wow.
And she was separated from her daughters, and her daughters carried that suitcase around for decades. And as they became, I think, in their 80s, they decided to open it, and this wealth of information had come out, and in the form of fiction novels, but was also kind of a snapshot into this other world. And I just really want to say thank you, because I think that the children, their voices are really critical, especially as we look right now in our society where there's a lot of suffering going on. And I think to look at children as individuals and as humans, not as just these little people who are not to be seen or heard, the intensity of their experiences really calls on all of us to pay attention and to listen to them. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. On behalf of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, thank you so much. We'll see you at our next event coming up in a few days. We hope you stay safe and be well. Thanks.
Thank you.